So, what is even going on here? Gamergate 2. What is it? That's a good question. So first, the reason why I'm talking about this is I made a video on the whole Sweet Baby Inc. situation a bit ago, which led to me getting brigaded by some lunatics, so that was cool, I guess. That's a first for me. I guess that just comes with the territory of being on the internet. Encounter whatever this is. I have so many questions, but they just won't answer them, so I don't know what the deal is. Anyways, a lot has happened since then, and basically the whole situation is being labeled as Gamergate 2. What does that mean? It's a long story. So if you're young, you may be wondering what Gamergate 1 was. And yeah, kind of same. I was still in high school when it happened. You know, I would see things about it as it was happening, but I wasn't like super invested in it or anything, and I never fully understood what was happening. You know, at the time, it seemed like people arguing about a bunch of unrelated things that were all, for some reason, being called the same thing, but I've come to find that there was one unifying trend, and I'll come back to that in a bit. So the Wikipedia page says Gamergate was a harassment campaign, but I'm just going to say that's not exactly how I remember it. And of course, I am probably going to get some of this wrong. Again, I didn't keep up with it too well as it was happening, but reducing it to simply a harassment campaign is pretty absurd in my opinion. Just from what I alone saw back when I was barely paying attention, like reducing that to just a harassment campaign is kind of like reducing any sort of like activist movement as a harassment campaign, because something about activist movements is they do inevitably harass people. Like that's kind of just something that happens, and I'm sure harassment was involved. I mean, that's just kind of the nature of the internet, and some people definitely are going to cross the line when that happens. But that unifying trend I was talking about is actually what started the original Gamergate: ethics and journalism, specifically game journalism, of course. And I think I have a unique perspective on this because I have worked in game journalism in the past. But before I get to that, we're going to talk about the origins of Gamergate. It kind of all started with the ex-boyfriend of an indie game developer, Zoe Quinn, implied that Zoe would sleep with journalists to get better review scores. Zoe claimed that this was just an upset ex-boyfriend, which would probably be pretty believable, but it didn't convince too many people as Zoe's game was well received by journalists, but very poorly received by the general public. Regardless of the reason for the journalists' positive reviews, it was clearly at odds with most gamers, which was kind of sketchy if you're like a game journalist. That's something that I feel like a lot of game journalists kind of missed the plot in a way, is that gamers should be their target audience. Why are you writing about video games if gamers aren't your target audience? But that's another thing I'll probably get back to later. You know, it's like if you saw positive reviews for Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5. You would immediately know something weird was going on. That game was trash. So that created like a whole big thing on the internet of people going after each other. Because yeah, I mean, something sketchy was going on. You know, whether it was because Zoe was sleeping with people, or there was money exchanging hands, or if it was just like nepotism or favoritism because of who her friends were. Whatever it was seen by many gamers as unethical. Then there was Anita Sarkeesian, who is probably the most known part of this. And Anita Sarkeesian basically wanted to be a game journalist for political reasons only, and really clearly didn't play games.
It's a soundtrack of one song, except I'm doing video games. So it's not exactly a fandom. I'm not a fan of video games. I actually had to learn a lot about video games in the process of making this.
At least not at the time. I think she started playing games, but she basically just complained about how women were represented in them, which you really don't actually need to play video games to say that. If that is a complaint you have, you can say it without even playing the game. Of course, people who do play the game just aren't going to care, which they're probably not going to care anyways. I don't think Anita Sarkeesian's audience ever were people who played video games. They were people who were a part of that specific wave of feminism, which has kind of died down recently. And then finally there was Brianna Wu, who Cindy Lou, who I still don't really know how they first got involved in the situation, but she was notable for claiming to receive hundreds of death threats, but not exactly providing evidence of them, at least not to the public. She then got caught making a post that many people considered faking harassment. There is an argument that it was supposed to be satirical, but she deleted it the second people caught on to it being her, which was like right away, because she was logged in like as her own account, so I don't know. She was also known for starting arguments with the most unhinged people she could find on the internet, seemingly to get actual threats made against her. And yeah, that would probably work for you if that's what your goal is. Like if you yell at insane people in real life, they'll threaten you too. The FBI got involved with these threats, but ultimately prosecutors didn't press charges against anyone, is it possible that these threats didn't go as far as she claimed they did, or perhaps weren't real at all? But also, I mean, the FBI is certainly not perfect, so maybe they really did drop the ball here. Supposedly 2 people admitted to committing crimes of some sort, but that just makes things weirder, because like, then couldn't Brianna just press charges? I really don't understand there. But regardless, journalists took her claims and just kind of ran with it. You know, they didn't scrutinize it, they didn't ask for evidence of any sort, they just published it because it fit their narrative. So things got weirder when political pundits of like all persuasions, who often had little to no knowledge of video games, got involved just to push their narrative. Stopped being about video games and just kind of devolved into your standard like left versus right mudslinging. You know, video games are kind of just a far backdrop, I guess. So how has the whole Sweet Baby controversy become like Gamergate? Well, several journalists came out to effectively run cover for Sweet Baby, writing articles about the situation, but omitting anything problematic that Sweet Baby and its employees did. They even ignored the whole thing that shot this into the spotlight, which was the attempt to mass report the FBI detective list. You know, when that happened, there was maybe like 1,000 people following the list. But you know, after this, it shot up to over 300,000 in like less than a month. Kotaku senior editor Alyssa Mercanti? I'm bad at pronouncing names. I think it's Mercante, I don't know. Which, by the way, this person blocked me for some reason. I give them like the mildest criticism when they blocked me. She shared threats that she supposedly received over this, although despite trying to get the identity of Cabrutus, who made the FBI detective list, she decided to hide the identity of the people threatening her. That sounds familiar. And then, since then, there's basically been a new controversy every few days, like the debate over Black Girl Gamers, another consulting firm that seems to have discriminatory hiring practices. Yeah, I mean, that's what the name certainly implies. Or the debate over female characters being turned ugly, which I feel like is being made into a much bigger problem than it really is. Like, yeah, there are some pretty good examples of, you know, the female characters being turned uglier than the actors that they're modeled on, but not the male characters. But at the same time, is that really something that we need to focus on? I don't know. I just feel like there's bigger problems. And then now you have Stellar Blade being proclaimed as some big stand against this. You know, and each time game journalists get involved, almost always to defend the big corporations making the games, which is a massive red flag. You know, I guess an exception would be Stellar Blade, which had this bizarre IGN article written about it, but it got taken down, so I don't know. But basically, it brings up many of the same questions about ethics in gaming journalism that we saw the first time. You know, can we trust journalists to accurately report on games when political activism and corporate funding constantly steer them in the opposite direction? I mean, the answer is no, not really. I mean, Kotaku is currently going through a soft rebrand, switching from whatever this is to a focus on objective game guides. Which, yeah, that should be a big part of game journalism, is game guides. But anyways, hilariously, many of the staff quit over this. This really is the state of game journalism, huh? And as someone who has worked as a game journalist, I think I have a unique perspective on it. So yeah, game journalism is rotten. And to most of you, that's obvious, but there's definitely a ton of people who simply haven't noticed yet, you know, whether it's because they don't pay attention to game journalism, or maybe it's just not something that ever came across as worth looking into. So the job is easy, but the pay is generally not good. Many of my fellow journalists would be forced to write about games that they had never played before just to make ends meet, which that's terrible. You know, there are some exceptions where you would write about a game you haven't played yet, but you're doing it in the context that you haven't played it yet. But these people would be like writing like actual guides and stuff like that. You know how they were doing it? Plagiarism. They were just watching people on YouTube or streamers do it and just stealing what they said, basically. You know, it's stuff like that. Or writing opinions on games they never played. Just weird. Like I straight up saw someone write a review on a game they never played. How? How do you do that? And even worse, there was a few that didn't play games at all. They didn't want to be game journalists. They wanted to be journalists. That's what was hiring at the time. So yeah, which, I mean, if you're in that position, you shouldn't be a journalist, just period. Like, if you have no journalistic integrity, don't be a journalist. Crazy, right? Editors and many senior writers at several outlets that I worked at or knew people that worked at were simply friends of the boss brought in for comfy positions. You know, these were the people that got paid the most, and they were almost always doing the least work by far. Generally because the way they got paid wasn't dependent on the amount of work they did. They had deadlines that they could miss if they wanted to. It really didn't matter. Again, they were friends with the boss. You know, they rarely ever knew about the topic, but got final say on everything, which led to some weird things like, you know, whole sections of articles being omitted or having to be rewritten because the editor doesn't actually understand the game and they think it's like this other game. You know, like I once wrote an article on Valorant and I had an editor ask me about attachments on the guns. I had to explain to them like 3 different times that there are no attachments in Valorant. That's not the type of game it is. And they were just like, look, this other person wrote articles about attachments. You can write articles about attachments. And I'm like, that's a different game. Anyway, sometimes they wouldn't even proofread, which is basically their whole job. They were basically glorified proofreaders. And other times they'd add their own opinions under the name of another author, which is incredibly messed up. And sometimes they do the opposite. They'd actually take articles written by like lower level staff writers and then throw like a more experienced author's name on it, which is very messed up when you consider how many of these low level writers are outsourced to countries with like low standards of living, basically because these outlets could pay them pennies. And that's really disgusting. You're taking someone's work that they did for basically nothing and then attributing it to someone who gets paid like 5 times the amount this other person makes. And yeah, it's really messed up. And overall, just very little about it in my experience was actually about video games. You know, I'm not saying that every outlet's bad or even every outlet I worked for is bad. Just that there's a lot of bad things going on that these outlets should really look to address, especially like when it comes to like the CEOs, because they probably don't even realize this is going on. And retrospectively, it was even weirder than I thought at the time. So eventually, work kind of dried up and I went independent and tried to work as a journalist by myself. So spoiler, that didn't really work. My work was absolutely higher quality than most of my competitors, but I was missing something, funding. I couldn't pay for ads or boosts, so, you know, competing with those at the top is pretty much impossible. You know, no matter how much I focus on SEO, no matter how early I was to a story, you know, cracking the first page in Google, you know, with relevant terms was seemingly impossible. You know, at least going through Google. And that raises another question. Where are these outlets getting funding? Like, do they actually have sizable audiences? I mean, one place I worked for didn't even run ads on their sites. I was honestly too afraid to ask how they made money. But all of that is actually why I'm here now. You know, YouTube is far from perfect, but, you know, it's a lot better for growing an audience than having a website. Also, I just prefer, you know, consuming video-based journalism anyways. And so this is something that I'd always kind of planned on doing. You know, I just anticipated having a better setup by the time I got around to it. You know, I'm just literally at like a flimsy table in my bedroom. Anyways, journalism as a whole is in a weird spot with very questionable ethics, and gaming journalism is just a part of that. The current wave of questioning ethics in journalism is being called Gamergate 2, and there is a lot of weirdness going on like all sides of it. And it can be pretty entertaining just to read like the ridiculous fights that you'll see on Twitter over it. But ultimately, my opinion on it is that questioning ethics and game journalism is a good thing and something that needs to be done. But I also feel like it's already getting off track and going the route of Gamergate 1. You know, like Matt Walsh, you know, conservative political activist who has criticized video games as a whole, does not like video games, made a video supporting the side of the gamers. But like, he doesn't actually care. He doesn't even like video games. He's just trying to use the situation to push his message, which is a big part of what gamers were trying to fight against. But so yeah, that's Gamergate 2, I guess. My advice is to just be a bit more careful with what media you consume, I guess. Like, you know, if there's an outlet that clearly has like very low journalistic standards, just don't read their articles anymore. You know, and if there's a video game that you don't like, don't buy it. Which of course was the whole point of SBI Detected. So yeah, I think that's a good thing. Like, yeah, if that's something that you don't like, you should absolutely be allowed to just not participate in it, not buy the game that you don't like, and not face harassment over it. But I don't know. Like I was saying earlier, the internet's the internet. What are you gonna do? But I say that because a big reason why this is even a discussion in the first place is because a lot of gamers have a bad habit of knowing a game's pretty mediocre or has something in it they don't like, and then buying it anyways. I mean, that kind of just ridiculous attitude to the situation is why we get trash games. You know, if you settle for trash, like, you're gonna get trash again. That's kind of just how it happens. You know, this goes beyond just, like, political views you may disagree with, and just, like, the general quality of games as a whole is going downhill really fast because people tolerate it, and y'all gotta stop. Stop buying trash games. And going back to journalism, it is harder to know what games are trash or not, because the journalists are clearly lying about it sometimes. But, you know, I think on YouTube, there's a lot of pretty honest people who don't even consider themselves journalists, who just, you know, talk about the games they like and why they like it. And even though they don't consider themselves journalists, that probably is the best gaming journalism there is out there right now. But like I said, not all game journalism outlets are bad. You know, and maybe consider supporting smaller outlets that have a lot more journalistic integrity. You know, you probably have to go out of your way to do it, but the alternative is getting drowned with like Kotaku and IGN articles every time you look up a game. But so yeah, that's going to be it for today. Let me know in the comments what you think. You know, like, do you think this is an important situation? Do you think it's a dumb situation? Maybe a bit of both even? sometimes that happens. I mean, that's pretty much every election is a dumb and important situation. And yeah, if you enjoyed the video, hit the like button. It helps me out a lot. If you want to see more, subscribe. You know, I probably won't be talking too much more about this topic if I do at all. So you may want to check out my other videos first to kind of see what my normal content is. But I kind of just talk about random stuff, mostly involving video games. So, but yeah, see ya.
Which they're probably not going to care anyways.